I am not a believer in the paranormal, but in my 60 years of life, I've had 5 occurrences that I cannot explain. Tonight, I would like to tell you another one of those happenings. My mother's family is from the state of Georgia. All of her family have lived for generations, about 7 or 8 generations, just north of Atlanta, Georgia, in an area near Dallas, a small community outside of Atlanta. And we have visited our relatives in that area off and on all of my younger life. And she had many uncles and aunts and cousins who lived there. And one uncle owned a large farm there at Dallas. Now this farm was on, part of it on the battlefield where some horrendous battles took place during the war between the states. Late in the war, Confederate General Hood was trying to defend Atlanta against advancing federal forces under the command of General Sherman. The Union had 100,000 plus soldiers in that effort, and being late in the war, the Confederates only had around 50 to 60,000 trying to defend Atlanta. And at that point in the war, if Atlanta fell, the Confederacy was lost. So it was a tremendous effort to try to hold on in the war between the states. General Sherman's plan was to cut off the supply routes going into Atlanta, to put the city under siege. And of course the rebel Confederate forces meant to keep those lines open. So there were horrendous battles in and around Atlanta, to the north and to the west of Atlanta. The battles were so bad, this whole area between Atlanta and Kennesaw Mountain up through this Dallas area became known as Hell's Hole. And these battles went on for months, from early summer 1864 until, I guess, early fall in 1864. And on some days 1,000 or thousands of troops would be killed. Many more would be injured or captured. And the total carnage for these battles around Atlanta in this Hell's Hole area ran into the tens of thousands over those months. My mother's uncle's farm was part of one of those battlefields, and there was an old farmhouse there on that farm that was used at that time as a field hospital. The forces came in and they needed a place to take care of their injured and their dying, so they took over a farmhouse. And one of the farmhouses on this farm was taken over and used as a field hospital during that terrible war. And because of that, this farmhouse was spared, and it existed not like other places around the South, but it existed after the war was over and was lived in and cared for by the family. And that farmhouse survived up into the 20th century. And the times that I would have visited there would have been after 1955, and that old farmhouse was still standing, and some of my mother's family was still living in that farmhouse. My brother had decided to go to school in Atlanta along about this time. So my mother and father and I, one weekend, drove from our home in Alabama to Atlanta to visit with my brother, and we did visit. And after that visit, Mother decided she would like to go by and see some of her cousins that still lived in this area. And one of those cousins lived in this old farmhouse, this old War Between the States farmhouse that I just described. And that was the place that we ended up going on our way back home. And it was almost dark when we got there. And the house was located far off the road with a long driveway at that time out in the country. And we drove up in the driveway and went to the door, and my mother's cousin's wife answered the door, and she had a small boy, a small son. I guess he was 4 or 5 years old, and then a smaller daughter who might have been 2 years old. And she invited us in, and it was around supper time, so we were invited to stay for what we call in the South supper. Other people call it dinner, but we call it supper. So we were invited to stay for supper, and we did that. We had a good supper and a good visit. Now, I had been to the old house before, sometime before that, and knew the history of where it was located and what it had been used for. At that time, I would have been a young teenager, 12, 13 years old maybe, and I'd always had an interest in the war between the states and things that happened during that time, so I knew a little bit about the history of the house. As a matter of fact, on some of our previous visit there, our cousin had taken us out around, and you could walk around in the yard and find war between the states artifacts, things laying around, mini balls and belt buckles and pieces of knives or swords and things like that. It was just plentiful in that area, just on top of the ground, or a little bit of breaking back the dirt, and you could find things. So I was really interested in going back to that house and to that area. And after supper, we went into the living room area and sat down to have a talk. And Mother and Dad had discussed spending the night, since it was so late. They would spend the night there with their cousin. Now, her cousin, Johnny, was not at home that night. It was just his wife, the young boy, and the daughter. And Johnny worked for the railroad. I don't know as an engineer or a conductor or a brakeman or whatever, but he was off on a trip on the railroad, so he wasn't there that night. So it was just those three and my mother and father and me. But anyway, after supper, we went into the living area, and I had already noticed around on several of the tables laying around were things from the war between the states, and maybe a belt buckle or a spur, or things that had been found on that battlefield around there that had been brought and placed around the house. And of course that struck up my interest, seeing those things. The little boy was around. The little girl was, like I say, very small, but the little boy was around, and he was down in the floor playing or doing whatever. But he was a very quiet youngster. He didn't say a lot, said hardly anything. And during the conversation, it got around to him, and finally got around to some of the things that were sitting around on the tables in the house, and about the history of the house. And his mother said that Billy, I think she called him Billy Boy, Billy Boy spent a lot of time out in the yard, in the fields, in the area around the house. He was out in the country, and he could go out and walk around, and at that time not being in any real danger or make his parents too concerned. So she said he spent a lot of time out in the fields and walking around. And he always found things. He'd bring things in, and it was just not unusual for him to bring in pieces of different military hardware that he had found out there. And he found lots of it and brought it in, and he started collection. He loved to do it. He'd spend hours out finding shots and pieces of old rifles and pieces of bayonets and buckles and straps and whatever he could find. And he had turned in for his young age to be a collector. And of course that tweaked my interest also, knowing that he had been out and found all these things. So as the conversation went on, she said to Billy Boy, said, "Why don't you take Richard upstairs and show him your collection?" And I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. I'd like to do that. And I said, yes, I'd like to see his collection. And Billy Boy got up and didn't say a word and walked straight over through the room. And like this was an old farmhouse, 2-story farmhouse. And when he left the living area, there were stairs that went upstairs. I was following him. He was leading the way and still hadn't said anything. And as we started up the stairs, I expected him to reach over and turn on a light switch or pull a cord and turn the light, but he did neither. And it was dark up those stairs. And even though I was a young teenager, I was a bit of a, in the South we call him scaredy cat. I was a bit of a scaredy cat, a chicken, as some would say. And I didn't really like the idea of going up those stairs in the dark, but I was embarrassed. This little 5-year-old boy was going up with no problem, so I walked up behind him. And we got to the top of the stairs, and there on the left was a door, evidently into his bedroom, where he had his collection. And we walked into the room, and this was a long room. If you've been in some older houses that are built 2 stories, sometimes a roof interferes with the ceiling in the room, and that's the type room this was, where there's a half wall maybe on one side of the room where the slanted ceiling comes down to that half wall. And in this room there were 2 beds. As I remember, they were child's beds or twins' beds, sitting on either side of a short door that was in that wall, in that half wall. And when Billy Boy walked inside, there was one small lamp on the bedside table there that didn't give very much light in that room at all. And he walked over between the beds, and he still had not said a word. And of course, I still wanted to see his Civil War between the states collection. And he turned around and looked me straight in the eye. Didn't blink, didn't smile, showed no facial expressions. And his first words to me said very clearly, and I was not mistaken, what he said. He said, in a 5-year-old voice, he said, looking me directly in the eye, "Do you want to see my ghost?" And cold chills ran all over me at that time, and they are running all over me right now. And I don't know if I said no, or I turned around and went straight out the door and straight down the stairs very rapidly, and went straight over to my mother and dad. I knew where I would be sleeping if we spent the night there, and it would be in that room. So I went straight over to my mother and dad and expressed to them in the strongest terms that I wanted to go home. And I had to repeat that several times, that I wanted to go home. And finally they said, "We'll go ahead and drive home." And we did. So we left that house. I didn't tell them till years later why I didn't want to spend the night in that house. And I've thought about it many times since then. And I wondered what Billy Boy had behind that door between those 2 beds. He was too young, I think, to pull your leg, to play a practical joke. He had something with his military Civil War collection, and he thought he had a ghost. And that's another of my ghost stories, and it's still unexplained.